Well, hello plant lovers. Thank you very much for finding me on this deep, bleak midwinter's Melbourne day. If you are new here, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne without any greenhouses or grow lights or humidifiers. And let me tell you, today I wish I had a heated greenhouse. However, I don't, so we just struggle on finding our way inside or outside, or we don't play at all. So, plant lovers, if that sounds like your orchid growing environment, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday, and my ramblings are just that, and of an amateur. But some of the things I find might help you in your orchid journey. And today, plant lovers, a much and oft requested follow-up. Yes, it's Zygopetalum rescue. What's going on with that plant video? There it is. I tell you what's been going on with this plant. It has been growing like the clappers. My goodness me, it is a big plant. But as you can see, what is most important is that it has flowered. And I didn't want to make the follow-up video until it had, because what's the point really? It's just bigger. And I have to say, it is a little disappointing. The flowers are very long lasting, but these were just in the process of opening. So I've just been waiting for them all to open and all look beautiful. And we have now just had a string of incredibly cold nights and mornings and wet. So the buds have been sort of blasted really by the cold, and the flowers have been damaged because it's almost got to 0 centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit, which is unusual for inner city Melbourne. So the flowers aren't looking their perkiest best. So I was waiting. Now we just have to make the video with some of the flowers not looking their best. It is still a celebration because it's flowered. And I was just checking, I made this repotting video 3 years ago. Look at the plant now. Look at that. My goodness. Now, the first thing everyone is going to scream, "Oh, look at the black spots. It's virused." No. Zygopetalums are just a bit notorious for getting spotted leaves, unfortunately. We're jumping ahead of the curve anyway. Let's talk about this right now. You see, spotted leaves, they're not attractive. It's kind of hard to avoid, I think. And exactly what causes it, hard to say. But I think one of the consensus is getting the leaves wet, but I think also cold, because this whole thing about leaves being wet, it rains on these orchids where they come from, and we'll get to that in a minute. So you know what? The leaves get wet in the wild. Why would that be an issue? But I think it is particularly, it's colder here than their native habitats. And I just think getting them wet and cold is not a great idea. So I think the leaves are just struggling a bit from that point. Often too, black spots can be about sun damage. I don't think in this case it is. Also, when I got this plant, it had leaves that were damaged like this. The other thing to observe is that the new leaves are green and beautiful. So most of my growths are lovely, and most of the older leaves are very spotted. So let's just allay that fear. Of course, you might be unlucky and have a plant that is riddled with disease, but who knows? But let's just calm down on the black spot front. If it really bothers you, maybe don't grow zygopetalums. But okay, let us go back to the very beginning. Firstly, I bought this on Facebook Marketplace 3 years ago. And in fact, I bought it by accident. Oops, I've got an orchid. No, not quite. But I was answering an ad for what was described as a golden orchid, which I knew was a Dendrobium speciosum. And I'll put the picture of mine in bloom. So that's the plant that I bought. And it was a really large specimen. And I think it cost about $50. Now, I was actually just in my favorite nursery, and there was a flowering example of a Dendrobium speciosum hybrid, and I think it was $295, same size. Do the maths. Moral of that story is Dendrobium speciosums are really expensive because it takes a long time, sometimes up to 10 years, for a seedling plant to get to flowering stage. And then obviously many more years before you've got enough canes that will flower. So you might be looking at a 15-year-old plant that's got that kind of bulk and oomph and amazing sprays of flowers. Hence it costs more. So a good thing to do is try and find a mature specimen that isn't going to break the bank. And a great way to do that is through orchid groups or such things as Facebook Marketplace if you're in an area where that is viable. It certainly is here in Australia. Lots of orchids sold on Marketplace or other such platforms. But anyway, we're digressing. What am I talking about? Anyway, the reason why I went to this house was to buy that Dendrobium speciosum. Now, the lady who was growing them, they were just out in her garden on the lawn in pots, but under the shade of eucalypt trees. So eucalypts are evergreen, obviously, but they don't have a dense canopy. So rain will pass through and lots of filtered bright light because the canopy is not dense. So it's kind of perfect, a perfect spot for orchids, perfect spot for cymbidiums anyway, but also Dendrobium speciosum. And what did I spot next to these but a zygo, this particular one? And I said, oh, is that for sale? Because it was such a great specimen plant. You jump to the head of the queue in the likelihood of getting flowers. So anyway, I ended up buying it. Not that that was my intention. There we are. I brought home my Zygopetalum. It was in a plastic pot, and I seem to remember it may even have had garden soil in it, which a lot of people do say they use for Zygopetalums, and there you go. I've also read many different versions of how you can best grow them, but they are quite versatile and can take many different mediums, but we'll get to that. Anyway, I felt that garden soil wasn't my medium of choice, nor the plastic pot, so I repotted it. And at the time, again, a lot of you said, oh, the roots, they're so delicate, it won't like it, be careful, be careful. Well, that didn't really prove to be the case. Look at that. I mean, it's going gangbusters. It's growing out of the pot now. It does actually need to be repotted. But my treatment of it certainly didn't set it back at all. In fact, far from it. It's grown and prospered. So maybe that is a bit of an urban myth. I mean, obviously, like anything, if you bash a root around or you break it or you bruise it, it's not going to love you for it, no matter what the plant or what the root is. So you should always be careful with the root systems of plants. Some are just much stronger than others. And actually, these have quite vigorous roots, a lot like cymbidiums. So I wasn't, white glovey with it. It was able to take some treatment to get it back in the pot. Anyway, it's fine and it's prospered. However, that was 3 years ago. It didn't flower. Why, I hear you cry. Well, let's get to that in a bit, shall we? First of all, then, let's go back to the beginning. Zygopetalum, what does that mean? Exotic Orchids of Australia by David L. Jones will reveal to us what it means. Zygopetalum, from the Greek zygos, a yolk, petalon, a petal. The swelling at the base of the labellum appears like a yolk. Sometimes these nomenclature and horticultural names are a very long bow. Who would look at that and think, that looks like a yolk? Now, a yolk being a thing that you carry pails of water across your back. So it's like a pole that's shaped around your neck that you can then carry buckets on. So, and a yoke for animals is again, the wooden thing that goes across the animal's neck to join them together that attaches them to a plow or something that they're pulling. So basically a wooden pole shaped to go around the neck of either a human or an animal linked to something else. I'm not seeing that. Not sure that I'm really seeing a yolk in this flower, but anyway, someone did, and that's where the name comes from. Anyway, who cares really? Zygopetalum it is. So where are they from? Well, they're all South American. There's quite a few species and probably from the central band of South America. So lots in Brazil and a few across into Argentina and Peru as well. Mostly reasonably moderate to higher altitudes, which means they're nearly always cold, cool, intermediate. So my given genre of orchids. They can take cooler temperatures. I do think though, just looking at the flower damage, it just has been a little too cold and anyway. So that's where they come from. There are a lot of Zygopetalums are terrestrial, some are epiphytes, and I think a couple might even be lithophytes. And given their sort of slightly more higher altitude conditions, they are from sort of much more misty, airy environments, which is something that you've got to try and replicate, but we'll get to that. So that's where they're from, and that's what the name means. Now, here in Melbourne, everyone says, they're so easy. Nonnas can grow these easily. And in fact, the lady I bought this from just had it under a tree and it bloomed every year for her. Well, 3 years later, I finally got my two spikes, which have just been blasted by the weather. But what took me so long? I'm going to read you two snippets. So, Orchids, a Practical Guide for Gardeners, and this is by Brian and Wilma Ritterhausen, quite a good book, says, Zygopetalums, while these orchids are considered more of a challenge, they are nevertheless well worth growing once you have gained some experience with easier types. And then Exotic Orchids in Australia by David L. Jones says, few orchids are easier to grow than common species of Zygopetalum, and these make excellent subjects for beginners. There, plant lovers, is a mixed message if ever there was one. So it's easy, it's not. What people do say about Melbourne, so our climate is really quite benign. It's actually sort of a really great horticultural environment because we don't freeze generally. Can get frosts further out of the city that you get, and obviously into the country there's alpine districts, but in and around city centre Melbourne, very, very, very horticultural prime climate. So it rarely gets to 0 degrees centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit in the inner city. Now, the last week has just been unusually cold for us at night at winter. So it has been quite cold. However, all of those sort of colder or even cool orchids can generally take outdoor temperatures at night with protection from rain. So what people say about Zygopetalums here is that they're a great companion plant to Cymbidiums, which do incredibly well in Melbourne, and I can grow those so easily and flower them. Dappled lights, they can deal with the cold temperatures. They're pretty tough when it comes to watering. You can forget to water them for weeks and they'll still survive. This, I have to say, is not that easy. So based on that sort of intel, I placed this plant, once I repotted it, with all my Cymbidiums, which are underneath a row of silver birch trees, which are deciduous. So in summer, they get dappled protection from the leaves. The leaves drop in winter, so the plants get more light, which is fantastic, because that's what they need to bloom. And then they get more shade again in spring as the new growth start to appear, because direct sunlight will damage the leaves. They can get a little bit of morning sun or late afternoon sun if it's gentle, but not too much direct light. It will burn the leaves. So I happily plonked this baby there. 2 years later, nothing. So I then thought, well, that ain't working. We're going to have to swap it up. So I then moved it to a different spot where it actually gets more light, and it gets direct morning light all year, and it's a little bit exposed, so it is getting a little bit of rain, hence the damage at the moment. It's got a bit rained on, a bit too cold at night, but so it's still reasonably protected. And it seemed to do very well. This was probably about a year ago I moved it. And so this cycle of growth, it has finally bloomed. So that clearly is where it wants to be. And all of these books actually say that it needs bright light. So I think my experience is that it needs just a bit more bright, indirect, consistent light than Cymbidiums do to thrive. Of course, if your Cymbidiums are in a particularly bright spot, then it's great for them. I think mine are slightly more on the shadier side. Didn't really suit Zygo. So once I figured that out, the paradigm has changed, and everyone says they're fragrant. They really are. This one, trying to think what it smells like. It's actually a vaguely sort of daffodil-y, but a bit more earthy, like an earthy daffodil fragrance. Really beautiful. And I've just put it in this room, and it's obviously a bit warmer, and it's really filling the room with fragrance. So let's look at the flowers. The flowers often have these sort of beautiful mauvey purpley variant lips and these sort of greeny mahogany brown burgundy speckled sepals and petals around here, and then the hybrids thereof produce all sorts of variations of them. You can get more green ones, more striking colorways, etc. So the species have been hybridized to produce all sorts of different colors, but they're often in a similar wheelhouse. But I didn't know what this one was, so I haven't bought any more because I didn't know what this one was going to do. So now that I know, I might be tempted to add to my Zygo collection now that I kind of know what they need from me. And what they do need, plant lovers, are bright indirect light, gentle morning light, perhaps if you can, more light than Cymbidiums. Next thing is they do come from these moist mountain areas, so they do need a bit of air movement. So if you can have them higher up so they're getting more breeze, great position for them. So mine's about chest height, so it gets lots of breezes. And as I said, it's kind of a bit more on the edge of my growing space, so it does get more breeze and more direct light in the early morning. Next thing is watering, of course. Everyone asks and everyone is concerned about that. Basically, I keep it moist all year. Now, I don't water it as much in winter, which is kind of obvious, but I water it a lot more in summer and try to keep the root ball really moist all the time because as you can see, it's a massive beast. Look at all those roots. Look at those juicy roots. So it does need, I find, just to be kept moist. It keeps the plant really healthy. And then slow release fertilizer in spring, just a sprinkling on the top. I put some slow release pellets in the mix when I repotted it, but as we know, that was 3 years ago. And liquid feed during the warmer seasons when it's growing and the weather is gorgeous. And that can either be a liquid fertilizer or a tonic that's sort of a seaweed based thing, or the runoff from a worm farm, and just dilute that always to sort of 1/8, 1/10 of what it says on the packet. And you won't be overfeeding them, but they'll love you for it. The other curious thing I think is just the flowering cycle. So I'll come in and show you, but basically you have these new growths, which you won't be able to see me holding up. No, I'll come in and show you closer. So when you get a new growth, the flower spike emerges at the same time and comes up. So this flower spike is emerging from this new growth, and this flower spike is emerging from this new growth down here. So whenever it produces new growths, you have the potential to get flowers. And that means that they can flower more than once a year. It just depends, I guess, on the hybrid that you've got and your relative conditions. This looks most like Zygopetalum intermedium. It might well be the species, or it might just be a hybrid that's very, very, very close to its species ancestors. Who knows? And really, you know what? I don't actually care that much. For me, as with most orchids, it's about the beauty of them. So I'm not hung up on having species zygos. I'd much rather actually have beautiful flowers. But this is very beautiful, but I think it's pretty damn close to the images of the species. So perhaps it is Zygopetalum intermedium. So Zygopetalum intermedium is Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, and high altitude. And even if this isn't the species, it's certainly very much drawing on that DNA. So I think we can look at the ideal growing conditions of that species, which will indicate, I think, what this one loves. And it is an awesome winter flower, and it is midwinter here now. So ta-da, ta-da, here we are. So I do think, although it is a cold grower, I do think these flowers have just got wet and colder than they would normally experience. So this plant doesn't have like a dry period per se, but it has a drier winter. So you'd imagine then that it's flowering at a drier season, whereby the flowers aren't going to get so water damaged. And I think here in Melbourne, of course, our winters are quite wet. And there you go. Now, Q has just decided that Zygopetalum intermedium is now Zygopetalum maculatum, subspecies maculatum, whatever. Anyway, this probably has a lot of that ancestry. Whether it actually is or it isn't the species, I mean, who really cares? I don't. But interesting that maculatum is terrestrial and grows in quite boggy, moist areas at that high altitude, which means it does want to be kept quite moist all the time, certainly its roots. However, these areas are seasonally dry, which means it's a little drier in winter. It's quite confusing, isn't it? I think ultimately, keep it moist, don't water it as much in winter, but don't let it dry out. Water it more in the warmer parts of the year. Okay, so let's just see if we can have a little look at this or what's going on. So you can see that it is very vigorous in its root system, and it has grown up and out of the pot that it's been in for 3 years. You can see that. So when I come to repot it, what I'm going to do is actually just lift it out and put it in a pot. I will have to get a pot that's deeper and wider, but I'm not going to shake it all about. I think most of the medium seems to have disappeared and been eaten by the roots. So medium, what are you potting it in? Well, I use a mix with this of medium bark. I also used a little bit, I think, of an out of the bag orchid mix because it's a bit grittier. and I probably used about 25% potting mix, so the sort of material that you'd use for regular perennial plants. And I also used a bit of organic matter, so otherwise known as poo. So chicken or horse manure, whatever it is, you get bags of manure that's a bit broken down from nurseries, or you happen to have access to animal poo yourself, then go for it. But it does need to be broken down, because otherwise fresh manure, as it were, it can really burn plants. So generally it's broken down a little bit, or put in your compost heap so it's broken down. Or the easiest thing is just to buy it from nurseries in a bag, and it's already gone through that process to some degree. So a little bit of an organic fertilizer, and then that fertilizing program throughout the year in the warmer seasons that you do with any orchid. So liquid fertilizer or a slow release pellet fertilizer. So I think even though it is terrestrial, and even though you are going to use a slightly different mix, it does still need to be free draining, I think. So although this plant does want to be moist, and that species does grow in moister areas, I think in pot culture it's important just to keep it free flowing, free draining, so that you can manage that. So you could keep it in a saucer, for example, just to keep the bottom of the pot moist. Or if you're watering often, if you're in a climate that can take that, then you can just keep the plant wet all the time. Anyway, figure out your own way of doing it, but I wouldn't be keeping it wringing wet. So back to them being great companion plants for cymbidiums, I feel that cymbidiums can take a lot less water. And when I go away on holiday, I just leave my cymbidiums and they have to just fend for themselves. And sometimes that's 2 weeks, and sometimes it's in midsummer. So they get bone dry. They're fine. I mean, they might not be fine. They might not thank me for it, but they're not dead. A zygo, I think, although again, it probably won't die because it's got big pseudobulbs, I don't think it appreciates that dryness or can take it as much as cymbidiums. So, two issues then about them being companion plants for cymbidiums. I think these need more light and more water. But the flowers are, it really is beautiful. And it's winter, so it's so great to have a fragrant flower. It's like Daphne or something, you know, in midwinter when you just think, what is that glorious smell? Well, it's an orchid. Now, I'm going to show you something else. Let's just reach over here. Look at this bushy, healthy little baby. Now, this is a seedling that I bought. If this is 3 years old, this might be 4 or even 5 years. And it was quite a small seedling when I bought it. And it is just, I think, kicking into its sort of growth spurt. So the pseudobulbs are just starting. Can you see this one here? So I'm just starting to get mature pseudobulbs. And there's a ton of new growths actually on this one. So if it was flowering size, it would be flowering. I still think, looking at the size of the plant, it's probably got a bit of growing to do. So once again, plant lovers, I would suggest don't go down the seedling route unless you're young and optimistic. It's probably better to try and find yourself a flowering size plant or division. Anyway, I bought this in the early days of my orchid career, not knowing a thing, thinking, oh, seedlings, you know, they're mature in a year, but no. Anyway, I think this is doing really well. It's really come into its own, and I've got it hung up so it's in a very breezy area, gets really bright indirect light. I'm keeping it moist but not too wet in winter, and it seems to be quite happy. And I think you can see too, you see those leaves, the ones that are brown are the very oldest leaves. All the other leaves are really fresh and green and unspotted. So back to this one, the older leaves that I inherited with the plant are certainly spotted. All the new ones tend to be much greener and happier. So I think it is largely a case of just not getting the leaves too wet in particularly cold weather, says he who just watered everything. And look at all the oops, the water on these leaves, and it's going to be cold again tonight. So we might get some leaf damage tomorrow. And if you're interested, this actually does have a label, and it is Zygopetalum Advance Australia with Zygopetalum Wilpenna, I think that is. There you go. Can you see that there? There we are. So who knows what that will look like, but at one point we'll find out, and when this flowers, I'll show you. And finally, the flowers are a little bit like cymbidiums. They can be long lasting, and they also do cut and last well as a cut flower in a vase. Not that I will. Anyway, these are just a bit scabby. They haven't really come into their own, but I could see why you'd want to cut them. The fragrance is stunning. Well, plant lovers, there you are. The much awaited follow-up to my Zygo rescue repot. The plant is really living its best life. It is finally flowered for me. I think, and I keep saying this about everything, once we move, I think I'll be able to give this the optimum space, better protection, and I'll know not to get it too wet in winter, not to get the flowers wet, because I do think that has been a negative for these. But anyway, they smell heavenly. It's really, really delicious. So I'm thrilled about all of this. I'm also thrilled that I've just got one to bloom. I made a video a while back with Ali, who's a local grower that I met through Instagram, and she had the same problem with me, could never get a zygo to bloom. And then about 6 months ago, she just casually posted a picture of a zygo in bloom. Well, Ali, here's mine. It's a bit scabby, but at least it's bloomed. So there we go, plant lovers. I'm looking forward to my Zygo journey continuing. I'm looking forward to this one blooming because I feel it's getting to that point soon enough where it's going to, maybe another year. I will keep you posted with all of that. And if I repot this one this season, which I might well do, I might do another video with that just to show you what I'm going to do. But plant lovers, in the meantime, I hope wherever you are, all's well. If you want to know what I'm doing next week, you'll have to hit subscribe and the notification bell, and you will know exactly when my video bursts forth into the ether. But until then, I hope all's well, take care, and I look forward to seeing you next week.